We've talked a little bit about what the Constitution is. Let's talk a little bit about what federalism is. The idea behind federalism is that we, as Americans, are going to be governed by multiple governments at the exact same time. When you think about it, there are going to be local governments, and when you talk about local governments, you might be talking about cities or towns or counties. Lexington, for example, or Davidson County. Above this local level are going to be the states. So this is pretty straightforward. The state government, meaning the state of North Carolina, and there are 50 state governments that are in the country. And then above the local and above the state, you now get to the point where you're dealing with the national, the federal government of the United States. There's only one federal government. But when you think about this and you actually add up all the numbers, yeah, there's one federal government, yeah, there's 50 state governments, but there are countless city, local type governments, cities, towns, counties, school boards, soil and conservation districts, and the numbers go on and on. If you added it up, there are roughly almost 90,000 governments that are in the United States. And when you put it in its most basic context, we as Americans are going to be living under the United States government. We as North Carolinians are going to be living under the state of North Carolina's government. We as residents of Davidson County are going to be subject to regulations from Davidson County type bodies, and then certainly if we live in Lexington, then the Lexington government is going to have a say as well. Right there, that's going to be 4 governments that are going to be simultaneously regulating your life or providing you services at the exact same time. And there can be some confusion on this. Where is it that the federal government and the state government, where is that line between how far the federal government can go and when the states can push back and say no more? Where is it that indeed the local and the city governments, what kind of authority do they have regarding the state and even ultimately regarding the federal government? This is the problem that federalism has, because on the one hand, when you've got an awful lot of governments, up to 88, 89, almost 90,000 of them, you've got a number of places where you can go and have input. You've got a number of places where you can go and receive services. You've got a number of places where you can actually run for office. Your voice is going to be heard. Maybe not in Washington, D.C., maybe not even in Raleigh, North Carolina, but if you approach the county folks in Davidson County, which might be a 15 or 20-minute ride, or for that matter, the folks in City Hall in Lexington, which is going to be shorter than that for most of you, you're going to have the ability to contribute, to influence, to receive services. Having said this, with all of these governments, that line between where you actually are supposed to go to get a problem solved blurs as well. Some of these governments are going to provide duplicated services, which means we're going to be wasting money for the same services to be provided in multiple locations. Some of these areas are it's going to be unclear what they know their responsibilities are to be. So it's very possible that they can forward you into other levels or other areas when they are actually the ones that are supposed to provide a given service. So there could be a little bit of a round and round in this. There could also be absolutely the ability to waste money because of duplicative services, which indeed is problematic. When you think about federalism in our context, if the federal government is faced with a problem, whether it is foreign relations, whether it is domestic spending, whether it is health care, whether it is dealing with natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, the federal government has got to find a specific power in the United States Constitution. If it has a specific power to base the law that it wants to pass on, then it can go forward. If it does not have a specific power, then it can't. That's why Article 1, where it says that Congress has the power to declare war, or Congress has the power to coin money, or Congress has the power to tax and regulate the postal routes. That's why this is important, because the Constitution was designed to provide limited powers, limited functions for the government. And if the Constitution did not grant the government a specific power, then in theory, within the context of federalism, these powers were left for the states to actually be the ones to exercise. Now think about it like this. The federal government, in order to pass a law, has got to find these powers. And the power that gives the federal government probably more authority than any other is the Interstate Commerce Clause. So you're probably saying, well, what is commerce? Commerce is going to be the exchange of goods and services. Let me repeat. Congress is the exchange of goods and services. So interstate commerce is going to be the exchange of goods and services that crosses state lines. In order for the federal government to exercise the commerce power, number one, there's got to be an exchange of goods or services, and number two, it must cross state lines. If either of these two conditions are not met, then the federal government does not have the ability to regulate. Now you're probably saying goods and services. How is it that this can actually be the part that the federal government gets the most power from? Well, think about it like this. I'm sure you've seen those commercials out there that deal with Florida orange juice. The Florida oranges, the Florida orange juice, and all of these kinds of things. The gist of it is that in North Carolina, while we may grow some oranges, the bulk of the oranges that we buy are actually going to be coming from Florida. That's going to be the exchange of a good, meaning we're paying for the good, the oranges, and indeed, since they've come from Florida, they've crossed state lines. Anything dealing with those oranges can now be regulated by the federal government. If you think about it in a different context, oranges are a good. A good could be sweaters. A good could be fruit, vegetables. A good could be things like beef or gasoline. It could be anything, any type of good. But there's also this context of services. Let's say that you solicit a prostitute, and I'm not necessarily saying this tongue-in-cheek. If you solicit a prostitute and you're caught in North Carolina, you solicited the prostitute, say, in Davidson County, you are caught with said prostitute in Rowan County, the state of North Carolina is going to be the law that's used in this, because everything that occurred within the state of North Carolina. If you solicit a prostitute in Lexington, and then you take said prostitute to Tennessee or South Carolina or Virginia, believe it or not, you have purchased a good or service, in this instance a service, and you have crossed state lines, which means now that the Interstate Commerce Clause, the federal government can punish you for this because you purchased that service and you crossed state lines. When you think about our lives, we buy an awful lot of things that are made in other states. We buy an awful lot of things that are grown in other states. Indeed, we ourselves, if we get on a train or a plane or a bus, if we're driving and we cross state lines, we are now the element of commerce, because as we cross these state lines, we are going to be spending money. In any of these circumstances, the federal government can use the commerce power to regulate trade, can regulate behavior. And when you think about this, whether it's buying the oranges, soliciting the prostitute, the federal government a number of years back went after child labor laws, or wanted to establish child labor laws, I should say, meaning they didn't want 6 and 8 and 10-year-olds working 12 and 14-hour days. That makes sense. Did they attack the morality of children working? No. Did they attack the safety of children working these long hours? No. They went after it and they said, okay, we want to regulate child labor. We want to pass laws to ban this. Well, what can we do? The furniture that the children were making was involved in interstate commerce. It was being sold across state lines, so the federal government used the commerce power to stop child labor. Again, it's not necessarily the good itself, but it's or the service, but it's the fact that it was actually sold in interstate commerce. The exchange of goods and services and the crossing of the state lines. This gives the federal government the commerce power. Now think about that medicinal marijuana article that I've given you this week for the paper. In that medicinal marijuana article, did the woman suffering from the cancer, did she cross state lines? Did she ever purchase that medicinal weed? Maybe you can argue no on that, but certainly think about these two conditions as you get into that article. One last point to think about. The federal government a number of years ago attempted to pass what was known as the Guns-Free School Zone Act. The Guns-Free School Zone Act. I mean, let's be honest, this is a slam dunk. It makes pretty good sense. We don't want kids, whether they're grade schoolers or high schoolers, to be able to carry guns on public school campuses. So the federal government wanted to pass a law with some enhanced punishments and certainly some safety precautions that the public schools, the local schools, if you will, were going to have to abide by. If this passes, in theory, it would make the schools safer. Again, it's a slam dunk, right? Well, not so fast. Even if you want to regulate guns on a school campus, you've got to have a power in the Constitution. What power did the federal government attempt to use? It attempted to use the commerce power, but this is what it said. Or actually, let me start. This is not what it said. It did not argue about guns crossing state lines or ammunition crossing state lines. It did not even argue about the manufacture of the guns being involved in different places. But effectively, the government argument was this. If students are scared to learn because there may be guns in the classroom, step one, they're not going to learn very much. And if they don't learn very much, step two, they are not going to get as good at jobs. And if they don't get as good at jobs, step three, they're not going to earn as much money. And if they don't earn as much money, step four, that is going to negatively impact interstate commerce because these kids are going to have less buying power. Okay, if I'm selling oranges and they cross state lines, that's basically a direct regulation. If I'm regulating child labor and the merchandise that they're purchasing or manufacturing is crossing state lines, that's maybe one step. But what we're talking about is if kids are scared to learn, they're not going to learn as well, they're not going to get as good at jobs, they're not going to get make as much money, and then indeed that's going to affect interstate commerce. That's like 4 or 5 steps away. The Supreme Court struck down the Guns Free School Zone Act. Did they strike it down because they wanted kids to be armed? Absolutely not. Did they strike it down because they didn't feel like this was a good law? Absolutely not. They struck it down because this was too strained of a reading of the commerce power, and this was one of the rare instances where the federal government had their wrists slapped, if you will, because they tried to go too far with a constitutional power. One last thing to think about. The Obama administration passed health care in his first 2 years in office. Health care is based on the Commerce Clause. And right now, the federal government, or going through the federal courts, I should say, citizens and groups are suing the Obama administration for this health care law. Why? Are they saying that it's going to waste money? Yeah, they probably are. Are they saying that this is socialism? Yeah, that's probably in there too. But the legal argument is that this is too broad of a reading of the commerce power. When you think about it, the federal government can require you to purchase automobile insurance. Why? Well, you're a driver. If you don't want to purchase automobile insurance, you don't have to drive, and you can skirt this. Well, with the health care bill that is basically making its way through the courts and is beginning to be implemented, the idea is that everybody in the country has got to buy the health care. They've got to contribute to the system. And there is some sense that they're saying, you know, that's a little bit too broad because we've never been forced to buy something in the history of the United States. You know, maybe we have to buy car insurance. Well, if we're driving, we do. But if we don't drive, we're technically not required to buy automobile insurance. In this instance, there's no loophole for the health care. And some people are saying that's too broad of a reading for the Commerce Clause, forcing people to buy something. Indeed, that is going to be a big question as we go through this year and maybe into next year regarding Obamacare. This, though, should give you a good sense of at least a beginning for what the commerce power is.